If a dog refuses to leave a dead man behind, there's usually a reason. Ethan Carter heard those words once from an old sheriff in northern Montana, but he never truly understood them until the night Rex stopped walking in the middle of Route 89. Snow drifted across the empty highway in slow waves under the pale glow of Ethan's headlights, while freezing wind rattled the side of his aging Ford pickup. The dashboard clock read 11:42 p.m. There were no other cars for miles, no gas stations, no houses, only endless pine trees stretching into darkness beneath the mountains. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel as Rex suddenly growled from the passenger seat. The German Shepherd's ears stood upright, eyes fixed on something ahead in the storm. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly. Rex let out another low growl before jumping down and pressing his nose against the cold window. That was when Ethan saw the figure. A man stumbled out of the snow near the side of the road, barely visible through the blowing wind. He looked disoriented, exhausted, like he had been walking for hours in the freezing cold. Ethan immediately hit the brakes. Tires scraped across the icy pavement as the truck slowed to a stop. Before Ethan could even react, Rex pushed against the door, whining anxiously. "Easy, boy." Ethan stepped out into the freezing air, his boots crunching against packed snow. The wind hit hard enough to steal his breath. The stranger collapsed near the ditch before Ethan could reach him. He was older, maybe late 60s, wearing a dark green coat covered in frost. His hands trembled violently as Ethan knelt beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" The old man opened his eyes just enough to look at Ethan. Fear lived inside them. Not panic, not confusion. Fear. His frozen fingers gripped Ethan's jacket with surprising strength before he forced a folded piece of paper into Ethan's hand. "Don't let them find it," the man whispered weakly. Ethan looked down at the paper. It was old, stained, and marked with hand-drawn lines and strange symbols that looked almost military. A map. Before Ethan could ask another question, Rex suddenly barked toward the forest across the road. Sharp. Aggressive. Warning. Ethan turned his head and saw movement between the trees. Just for a second, a flashlight beam disappeared behind the pines. His stomach tightened instantly. Someone else was out there. The old man grabbed Ethan's sleeve one last time. "If the dog remembers," he whispered, struggling for breath, "you're already part of it." Then his hand slowly slipped away. Silence swallowed the highway except for the wind. Ethan stared at the stranger, confused by the final words, but Rex kept growling toward the woods, fur raised along his back. Ethan folded the map carefully and shoved it into his jacket pocket before helping the man into the truck. But as he reached for the passenger door, Rex refused to climb inside. The German Shepherd stood frozen in the snow, staring directly into the dark forest like he recognized something hidden there. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the terrifying sensation that something had already begun long before he arrived. People say dogs react to fear faster than humans because they notice danger before the human mind is ready to accept it. Ethan kept thinking about that as he drove through the storm with both hands locked tightly on the steering wheel. The old man lay unconscious beneath a wool blanket in the back seat, while Rex remained completely silent beside the passenger door. That silence bothered Ethan more than the growling had. Rex was never quiet when something felt wrong. Snow hammered against the windshield as the truck pushed north through the mountains. The nearest town was nearly 30 miles away, and cell service had disappeared over an hour ago. Ethan glanced at the folded map resting on the dashboard. Even under the dim lights of the truck, the paper looked strange. The edges were burned slightly, and several locations had been circled with dark red ink. There were no street names, no official markings, only rough terrain sketches and symbols Ethan did not recognize. One location near the center had a handwritten note beside it. Black Pine Ridge. Ethan had lived in Montana most of his life and had never heard that name before. Rex suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched toward the rear window. Ethan checked the mirror immediately. Headlights appeared behind them through the storm. Far back at first, then closer. Ethan frowned. Nobody should have been driving that highway in weather like this. The truck behind them stayed at a distance, never passing, never falling behind. Rex let out a low warning growl again. "I see them," Ethan muttered. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, but the icy road limited how fast he could safely drive. The headlights remained there, steady and patient. Ethan tried convincing himself it was coincidence. Another traveler. Another truck heading north. But deep down, he knew that was not true. 20 minutes later, the glowing sign of an isolated gas station finally appeared through the snowstorm. Half the neon letters were burned out, leaving only the word gas flickering weakly against the darkness. Ethan pulled into the lot quickly. The other vehicle slowed near the entrance of the station but never entered. It continued down the highway before disappearing into the storm. Rex remained tense, eyes locked on the road long after the headlights vanished. Ethan stepped out into the freezing air again and opened the back door. The old man was awake now, barely. His breathing sounded shallow. "You need a hospital," Ethan said. The old man slowly shook his head. "No hospitals." His voice cracked painfully. "They check there first." Ethan stared at him carefully. "Who checks?" The old man looked toward the dark highway with visible fear before reaching weakly toward the map again. "Black Pine Ridge," he whispered. "The dog knows the way." Ethan almost laughed at how absurd that sounded, but Rex suddenly jumped down from the truck and walked straight toward the forest behind the gas station. Not wandering, not exploring, purposeful, focused. Ethan called his name once, but Rex did not stop. The German shepherd moved toward the tree line like he was following a memory buried somewhere deep inside him. Then the old man grabbed Ethan's arm tightly enough to make him flinch. "Do not let him go alone." Ethan looked back toward the woods where Rex had already vanished into the falling snow, and for reasons he could not explain, the cold suddenly felt much worse. Some places feel abandoned until you realize something is still watching from the dark. Ethan grabbed his flashlight from the truck and stared toward the forest behind the gas station where Rex had disappeared moments earlier. Snow continued falling heavily, covering the ground faster than the wind could clear it. The old gas station stood silent behind him except for the faint buzzing of broken neon lights and the distant hum of an old generator somewhere near the building. Ethan looked back at the old man in the truck. "Stay here," he said. The man nodded weakly beneath the blanket, but his frightened eyes never left the tree line. Ethan pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the snow. Rex's paw prints were still visible, leading directly into the woods behind the station. At first, Ethan expected the dog to return quickly. Rex had chased deer before, wandered after scents before, but this felt different. The tracks moved in a straight line without hesitation, deeper between the pines where darkness swallowed the beam of Ethan's flashlight. The farther Ethan walked, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed weaker inside the forest. Snow clung to every branch overhead, while towering trees blocked most of the moonlight. Ethan checked the tracks again. Still straight. Still deliberate. "Rex," he called out. No response. Only silence. Then finally, somewhere ahead, a single bark echoed through the trees. Ethan moved faster. The snow reached nearly to his knees in some places, slowing every step. After several minutes, he noticed something strange. Old wooden posts stood half-buried beneath the snow beside the trail. They looked weathered, almost forgotten. Ethan brushed snow off one with his glove and found faded yellow paint beneath the ice. Numbers. Trail markers. Someone once maintained this path. Another bark echoed closer this time. Ethan followed it until the trees suddenly opened into a small clearing. And there stood Rex. The German shepherd was motionless near the edge of a frozen creek, staring toward an old cabin partially hidden beneath snow-covered branches. Ethan stopped immediately. The cabin looked abandoned for years. Half the roof sagged inward, and the front porch leaned crookedly toward the ground. Snow had piled against the walls nearly halfway up the windows. But one thing made Ethan's stomach tighten instantly. Smoke drifted faintly from the metal chimney. Someone had been there recently. Rex walked toward the cabin slowly without barking again. Ethan followed carefully, every instinct telling him to leave. The front door hung slightly open. Wind pushed it back and forth with soft creaking sounds. Ethan raised the flashlight and stepped closer. Inside, the cabin looked frozen in time. Dust covered the furniture. Empty shelves lined the walls. An overturned chair rested near an old stone fireplace where weak embers still glowed beneath ash. Somebody had left in a hurry. Ethan noticed boot prints across the wooden floor. Fresh ones. He knelt beside them carefully. Large boots. At least two different people. Then Rex growled softly near the far corner of the room. Ethan turned his flashlight toward the wall and froze. Carved directly into the wood beside the fireplace was a single name. Carter. Ethan stared at it silently. His last name. Deep grooves cut into old timber, like somebody wanted the mark to survive long after they were gone. Beneath it, almost hidden by age and dust, another sentence had been scratched into the wall. If you found this place, they already know. The worst feeling in the world is discovering that somebody knew your name long before you arrived. Ethan stood frozen inside the cabin while snow blew softly through the cracked doorway behind him. The carved message on the wall felt impossible to ignore. Carter. His family name cut deep into old wood beside a warning that made the air inside the room suddenly feel colder. Rex remained near the fireplace, nose low to the floorboards, sniffing carefully around the scattered boot prints. Ethan slowly approached the wall and ran his fingers across the grooves. The cuts were old, but not ancient. Maybe 10 years. Maybe less. He swallowed hard as memories of his father surfaced again. Daniel Carter disappeared when Ethan was 14 years old. No body was ever found. The official report claimed his truck slid off an icy mountain road somewhere west of Helena, but Ethan remembered the strange details his mother never talked about. The missing police records. The sudden visit from federal agents 2 days after the accident. The locked boxes his father kept hidden in the garage. Back then, Ethan had been too young to question any of it. Now standing inside that cabin, the past no longer felt buried. Rex suddenly lifted his head and walked toward a narrow hallway near the back of the cabin. Ethan followed with the flashlight raised carefully. The hallway led to a small bedroom covered in dust and collapsed ceiling plaster. Most of the furniture had rotted away except for an old metal desk pushed against the far wall. One drawer hung partially open. Rex stopped beside it immediately. Ethan crouched and pulled the drawer wider. Inside sat a faded photograph beneath several papers damaged by moisture. Ethan picked it up slowly. The image showed 3 men standing beside a Forest Service truck somewhere in the mountains. One of them was unmistakably his father. Younger, bearded, wearing a heavy winter jacket and smiling directly at the camera. Ethan stared at the picture silently until he noticed something else. Beside his father stood the same old man currently waiting back at the gas station. But the third person had been scratched out completely. The face was destroyed with deep knife marks across the photograph. Ethan turned the picture over. Written on the back in faded black ink were 4 words. Black Pine Ridge Facility. A loud crack echoed outside. Ethan spun toward the window instantly. Branches moved near the tree line beyond the cabin. Rex barked sharply and rushed toward the front room. Ethan shoved the photograph into his jacket and followed fast. The wind outside had grown stronger, but something else changed too. New tracks crossed the snow near the porch. Fresh boot prints. Multiple sets. Somebody had arrived while Ethan was inside. Rex growled low in his throat, staring toward the woods behind the cabin. Ethan killed the flashlight immediately, his heart pounding hard enough to hurt. Through the darkness between the trees, faint beams of light moved slowly across the snow. Flashlights. Searching. Ethan backed away from the window carefully as Rex pressed close beside him. The old floorboards creaked softly under his boots. Then from somewhere outside the cabin, a calm voice called through the storm. "Mr. Carter," the man said clearly, "you are carrying something that does not belong to you." Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who speak calmly in the dark. Ethan stood motionless inside the cabin while Rex remained pressed beside his leg, growling low enough to vibrate through the floorboards. Snow swirled outside the broken windows as flashlight beams drifted slowly between the trees. Whoever was out there knew his name. That alone terrified him more than the storm. "Mr. Carter," the voice called again from outside, steady and controlled. "You do not understand what you are involved in." Ethan backed away from the front room carefully, keeping his breathing quiet. Rex mirrored every movement beside him without taking his eyes off the doorway. Ethan's mind raced. The map rested inside his jacket pocket beside the photograph of his father. Somehow these strangers knew about both. Another flashlight beam swept across the cabin wall, briefly illuminating the carved warning again. If you found this place, they already know. Ethan finally understood what it meant. A floorboard creaked loudly near the front porch. Someone was approaching the cabin itself now. Rex's growl deepened instantly. Ethan scanned the room desperately for another exit. The back hallway led nowhere except the ruined bedroom. Windows were too small. The front door was exposed. Then Rex suddenly moved. The German Shepherd walked quickly toward the fireplace and pawed hard against the floor beside it. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" Rex barked once and scratched again at the warped wooden boards. Ethan knelt beside him and pushed aside an old rusted bucket resting nearby. Beneath it, almost hidden beneath dirt and ash, was a metal ring attached to the floor. A hatch door. Ethan grabbed the ring and pulled hard. The old wood resisted at first before lifting open with a sharp crack of frozen hinges. Cold air rushed. Upward from darkness below. Stairs disappeared beneath the cabin into what looked like an underground tunnel. Outside, footsteps reached the porch. Ethan heard snow crunch beneath heavy boots. Without hesitation, he grabbed the hatch and motioned for Rex to move first. The dog immediately descended into the darkness. Ethan followed quickly, lowering the hatch above them just as the front cabin door creaked open upstairs. Complete darkness swallowed them instantly except for Ethan's flashlight beam. The underground tunnel looked ancient, reinforced with rotting support beams and damp concrete walls stained by decades of moisture. Water dripped somewhere ahead in slow rhythmic echoes. Rex moved carefully down the narrow passage as though he already understood where to go. Ethan stayed close behind, his pulse pounding in his ears while muffled voices echoed faintly above through the cabin floor. "Search everything," one man said. Another replied quietly, but Ethan could not hear the words clearly. The tunnel sloped downward for nearly 50 yards before opening into a wider chamber beneath the mountain itself. Ethan froze again when his flashlight swept across the walls. Symbols identical to the ones on the map had been painted directly onto the concrete. Arrows, coordinates, warning signs. This was not random. Somebody built this place intentionally. Rex suddenly stopped near a steel door at the far end of the chamber. Unlike everything else underground, the door looked newer, cleaner. A faded government warning label still clung to the side. Ethan stepped closer carefully and wiped dust away with his sleeve. Beneath the dirt, black printed letters slowly became visible. Black Pine Ridge Research Site. Then somewhere far deeper inside the tunnel system, a loud metallic sound echoed through the darkness like another door slowly opening. There is something deeply unsettling about hearing machinery move in a place that should have been dead for decades. Ethan kept his flashlight fixed on the steel door while the metallic echo rolled through the underground tunnel again. Rex stood completely still beside him, ears raised sharply toward the darkness ahead. The chamber smelled damp and cold, filled with rust, mildew, and stale air that had not circulated properly in years. Ethan glanced back toward the tunnel leading to the cabin above. Faint footsteps still echoed somewhere overhead. The men searching for him had not left. That meant going backward was no longer an option. Rex slowly approached the steel door and sniffed along its edges. The old government label was faded almost beyond recognition, but enough remained to make Ethan uneasy. Research site. The words repeated in his mind. His father had never worked for the government officially. At least that was what Ethan always believed. Yet somehow Daniel Carter's name had been carved into a hidden cabin connected to a buried facility beneath the mountains. None of it made sense anymore. Ethan pushed carefully against the steel door. At first it refused to move, frozen partially shut by age and corrosion. He pushed harder until finally the hinges groaned loudly, and the door opened inward several inches. Cold air drifted out from the darkness beyond. Rex immediately stepped inside without hesitation. Ethan followed with the flashlight raised. The room beyond looked like an abandoned operations center. Dust-covered metal desks lined with old equipment and dead computer monitors. Torn papers littered the floor beneath collapsed ceiling panels. One wall held large maps of the surrounding mountains covered with red markings and handwritten notes. Ethan moved deeper into the room slowly, scanning everything around him. Most of the labels had faded, but one phrase appeared repeatedly across several folders scattered near the desks. Behavioral Tracking Program. Ethan frowned. None of this resembled military research. It looked more like observation records. Study files. Monitoring reports. Rex suddenly stopped beside a long metal cabinet against the far wall. He sniffed intensely near one drawer before pawing at it. Ethan pulled the drawer open carefully. Inside rested dozens of cassette tapes stacked neatly in rows, each labeled with dates stretching back nearly 20 years. One tape, sat separately near the front with a handwritten name across the sticker. Daniel Carter. Ethan stared at it silently before picking it up with shaking fingers. Beside the cabinet sat an old portable tape recorder connected to a power supply somehow, still running on weak backup electricity. A faint green light blinked across the machine. Ethan hesitated only a moment before inserting the tape. Static filled the room first. Then a voice emerged. His father's voice. Older than Ethan remembered. Exhausted. "If anybody is hearing this," Daniel said slowly, "then the ridge is compromised." Ethan felt his chest tighten instantly. Rex remained beside the recorder, staring toward the hallway beyond the room as though standing guard. The recording crackled again. "They told us the program was about rescue tracking and environmental adaptation," Daniel continued. "That was never the truth." Ethan lowered himself slowly into a nearby chair, unable to look away from the recorder. "The dogs remembered things they should not remember," his father said quietly. "Places, voices, people, even after separation." Ethan's eyes moved toward Rex immediately. The German shepherd looked back at him with complete stillness. Then the tape crackled once more before Daniel spoke the next sentence in a trembling voice. "If my son ever finds this place, it means Rex brought him here. Some truths change your understanding of the world forever, and others make you question every memory you ever trusted." Ethan sat frozen beside the tape recorder while the weak green light blinked across the dusty room. His father's voice echoed softly through the abandoned underground facility, distorted by static but unmistakably real. Rex remained alert near the hallway entrance, watching the darkness while Daniel Carter continued speaking from the cassette. "The dogs were never supposed to retain long-term environmental memory," his father said carefully. "That was the official expectation. But some of them adapted beyond prediction." Ethan stared at Rex again. Snow and melted ice still clung to the German shepherd's thick fur from outside, yet the dog looked calm here underground, almost familiar with the place. The tape crackled. One subject responded differently than all the others. Subject 7. Ethan felt cold spread through his chest. Rex slowly turned his head toward him as though recognizing the number. He remembered routes after a single exposure, Daniel continued. He could identify individuals years later through scent recognition alone. But the most concerning development was emotional attachment retention. Ethan shook his head quietly, trying to process the words. Rex had been with him since he was 16 years old. A rescue adoption from a retired military kennel outside Billings. Ethan always believed the dog had simply been unusually intelligent, loyal, protective. But now every strange instinct Rex ever showed suddenly carried a darker meaning. The tape hissed again before Daniel's voice lowered. When they realized the program could be weaponized for tracking and retrieval operations, everything changed. Somewhere deep in the facility, another metallic sound echoed faintly through the tunnels. Rex immediately stiffened. Ethan looked toward the hallway, his heartbeat quickening again. The facility was not completely empty. "I tried to shut the project down," Daniel said on the tape. "That is when they started monitoring my family." Ethan's throat tightened. He remembered black government vehicles parked outside their house years ago. He remembered his father becoming paranoid near the end, checking windows constantly, locking doors twice at night. Back then, Ethan thought grief and stress were destroying him. Now those memories felt different, more dangerous. "If you are hearing this," Daniel continued, "then they either found me, or they found you first." Suddenly, the tape recorder clicked loudly and stopped. The green light flickered weakly before dying completely. Silence filled the room again except for distant water dripping somewhere underground. "No," Ethan muttered, hitting the side of the recorder. Nothing happened. Power finally failed. Rex let out a low warning growl toward the hallway. Ethan rose from the chair immediately and grabbed the flashlight again. Faint sounds drifted through the tunnel system now. Footsteps. Slow but deliberate. Somebody else had entered the underground facility. Ethan quickly scanned the room for another exit. Near the back wall, he noticed a narrow maintenance corridor partially hidden behind collapsed shelving. Rex moved toward it instantly without needing direction. Ethan followed, but before leaving, his flashlight swept once more across the old maps hanging on the wall. One location near the northern ridge had been circled repeatedly in red marker beside a handwritten note from his father. Transfer point. Do not bring subject 7 above ground. Ethan stared at those words for one chilling second before Rex barked sharply from the corridor ahead. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer now, and for the first time since finding the old man on the highway, Ethan realized the people hunting them might not only want the map. The deeper Ethan moved into the mountain, the more it felt like the facility itself was trying to stay buried. The maintenance corridor narrowed quickly behind the abandoned operations room, forcing Ethan to duck beneath hanging pipes and exposed electrical cables coated in frost. Rex moved several feet ahead, silent and focused, occasionally stopping to listen before continuing deeper into the darkness. The flashlight beam shook slightly in Ethan's hand as distant footsteps echoed somewhere behind them through the tunnels. Whoever entered the facility was moving carefully now. Hunting. Ethan kept replaying his father's words in his mind. Subject 7. Emotional attachment retention. Do not bring above ground. None of it sounded like normal research anymore. The corridor eventually opened into another underground section much larger than the first. Ethan stopped immediately as his flashlight swept across rows of old chain-link enclosures lining both sides of the room. Kennels. Rusted metal doors hung partially open, while faded warning labels peeled from the walls nearby. Some cages still contained overturned food bowls and shredded blankets frozen stiff from years of cold air. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. This place had housed dogs. A lot of them. Rex walked slowly between the enclosures without fear, nose close to the floor as though following a familiar scent trail. Ethan noticed numbers painted above several. Kennel doors. 1, 3, 5. Most had been crossed out with red spray paint. Near the far corner of the room, one enclosure remained different from the others. Larger, reinforced with thicker steel bars. Above the door, faded black lettering still remained visible beneath rust and dust. Subject 7. Ethan stared silently at the enclosure while cold dread settled into his chest. Inside rested an old military-style dog harness hanging from a hook on the wall. Rex approached the cage slowly and stopped at the entrance. His ears lowered slightly. Not fear. Recognition. Ethan stepped closer carefully. Attached to the harness was a small metal tag. He lifted it into the flashlight beam and read the engraving aloud under his breath. Rex. The sound of his own voice echoed weakly through the underground chamber. Ethan looked at the German shepherd standing beside him. You were here, he whispered. Rex looked back at him calmly, tail motionless, eyes reflecting the flashlight in the darkness. Suddenly, a loud metallic crash echoed somewhere behind them in the corridor they had just crossed. Ethan spun instantly toward the sound. Voices followed seconds later. Closer now. Search every section, a man ordered firmly. He cannot leave the facility. Ethan grabbed the harness and shoved it into his backpack quickly. Rex immediately moved toward another hallway near the rear of the kennel chamber. Ethan followed fast, trying to keep his breathing controlled. The new tunnel sloped downward again, deeper beneath the mountain. Emergency lights flickered weakly overhead every few yards, casting brief flashes of pale red across damp concrete walls. Water dripped steadily from cracked pipes above. The deeper they descended, the colder the air became. After several minutes, Rex suddenly stopped near a heavy blast door partially wedged open. Beyond it stretched a narrow underground rail tunnel disappearing into darkness. Old transport tracks ran along the floor towards someplace farther beneath the mountain. Ethan aimed the flashlight ahead and noticed something strange on the wall beside the tunnel entrance. Fresh footprints. Not from the men chasing them. Smaller. Uneven. Someone else had already passed through recently. Then from somewhere far down the rail tunnel, a weak voice echoed through the darkness. Ethan. The sound froze him instantly because he recognized the voice. It belonged to the old man from the highway. When a voice finds you underground in the middle of nowhere, fear becomes impossible to separate from hope. Ethan raised the flashlight toward the dark rail tunnel while Rex stood rigid beside him, ears pointed forward. The old man's voice echoed weakly again from somewhere ahead. Ethan, hurry. His words sounded strained, exhausted, barely strong enough to travel through the tunnel. Ethan exchanged one quick glance with Rex before moving forward along the abandoned tracks. The tunnel stretched deep beneath the mountain, lined with cracked concrete walls dripping cold water onto rusted rails below. Weak emergency lights flickered every 30 or 40 feet overhead, bathing sections of the passage in dull red light before fading back into darkness. Behind them, distant voices still moved through the upper sections of the facility. The men searching for Ethan were getting closer. The farther Ethan walked, the stranger the tunnel became. Old transport carts sat abandoned beside the rails, some overturned, others partially buried beneath collapsed debris. Warning signs covered the walls at intervals. Authorized personnel only. Biological containment area. Several doors along the tunnel had been welded shut from the outside. Ethan tried not to imagine why. Rex suddenly accelerated ahead, claws scraping lightly against concrete. Ethan followed faster until the tunnel finally widened into a circular underground platform. At the center stood an old transport car resting silently on the rails. One side door hung open. The old man from the highway sat inside wrapped in blankets beside a portable lantern glowing softly in the darkness. He looked far worse than before. His face had turned pale beneath layers of exhaustion, and his breathing sounded uneven in the freezing underground air. But when he saw Rex, relief filled his eyes instantly. "He found you," the old man whispered. Rex approached carefully and rested his head briefly against the man's knee. Ethan stared at both of them in confusion. "You know him," Ethan said quietly. The old man nodded weakly. "Long before you did." Ethan stepped inside the transport car, lowering the flashlight slightly. "Who are you?" The old man hesitated before answering. "My name is Walter Hayes. I worked with your father at Black Pine Ridge." Ethan felt tension tighten through his chest again. "What was this place?" Walter looked around the dark tunnel carefully before speaking. At first, it was presented as a behavioral research facility. Search and rescue training. Environmental memory retention. Military applications. He coughed hard into his sleeve before continuing. "But your father discovered the project was becoming something else." Ethan removed the folded map from his jacket. "Why are people chasing this?" Walter stared at the map for several silent seconds. "Because it leads to the final archive." Ethan frowned. "Archive of what?" Walter looked directly at him. "Everything your father tried to expose." Silence filled the underground platform except for distant metallic groans echoing through the facility around them. Rex suddenly lifted his head again and growled toward the far tunnel entrance. Walter noticed immediately. "They are closer than I thought." Ethan stepped toward the tunnel opening and listened carefully. Footsteps. Multiple sets. Slow and controlled. Flashlight beams flickered faintly somewhere far back along the rails. Walter grabbed Ethan's arm weakly. "There is another exit north of here," he whispered urgently. "An emergency lift beyond the frozen lake." Ethan helped him stand carefully while Rex stayed positioned between them and the tunnel. Walter's legs shook from exhaustion, but fear seemed to push him forward. Then before they could move, a calm voice echoed through the underground tunnel behind them. The same voice from the cabin. "Walter," the man called evenly. "You should not have brought him here. The most terrifying thing about being hunted is realizing the people chasing you already know exactly where you are going." Ethan slowly turned toward the tunnel behind the transport car while Rex stepped forward protectively, body tense and eyes fixed on the approaching lights. Several flashlight beams moved through the darkness between the rails, growing brighter with every second. Walter gripped the edge of the transport car for support, breathing hard from exhaustion. "We do not have much time," he whispered. The calm voice echoed again through the tunnel. "Daniel Carter made many mistakes," the man said. "Do not repeat them, Ethan." A tall figure finally emerged from the darkness ahead of the other searchers. He wore a black winter coat and heavy boots dusted with snow, his expression composed in a way that felt far more dangerous than anger. He looked to be in his late 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that never left Ethan. Rex growled louder immediately. The man noticed. "Still loyal after all these years," he said quietly while studying the German Shepherd. "Impressive." Ethan tightened his grip on the flashlight. "Who are you?" The man stopped several yards away beneath the flickering emergency lights. "My name is Victor Lang." Walter looked away instantly at the sound of the name, fear visible across his exhausted face. Victor noticed. "Walter should have told you the truth much sooner." Ethan stepped slightly in front of Walter without fully realizing it. "What truth?" Victor folded his hands calmly. "Your father was not trying to destroy Black Pine Ridge." Ethan frowned. "That is not what the recordings said." "Because Daniel only recorded part of the story," Victor replied. "He realized the program had value. Extraordinary value. Rex barked sharply, interrupting him. Victor glanced toward the dog again with strange fascination. Subject 7 exceeded every projection we ever had. Memory retention, terrain recall, emotional bonding, adaptive response. Ethan felt anger rising now. Stop calling him Subject 7. Victor remained calm. Then perhaps you should stop pretending he is an ordinary dog. Silence filled the tunnel for several long seconds. Ethan could hear distant generators humming somewhere deep beneath the mountain. Water dripped steadily from pipes overhead, while snowmelt ran across the tracks near their feet. Walter finally spoke weakly. Victor wanted to expand the program beyond rescue work. Tracking operations, surveillance, retrieval. Victor sighed softly. The world changed after the attacks in 2001. Governments wanted tools capable of locating anyone anywhere. Daniel understood that eventually. Ethan shook his head. My father disappeared because of this place. Victor's expression darkened slightly for the first time. Your father disappeared because he stole the archive. Ethan froze. Walter looked equally stunned. That is impossible, Walter whispered. Victor slowly pointed toward the folded map still inside Ethan's jacket pocket. The archive was never data alone. Daniel embedded access routes, locations, and research logs across multiple dead zones throughout the mountains. That map is the final key. Rex suddenly moved closer to Ethan, pressing firmly against his side while staring at Victor with unwavering focus. Victor noticed the behavior immediately. Interesting, he murmured quietly. He remembers me too. Before Ethan could respond, warning alarms suddenly echoed through the underground tunnel. Red emergency lights began flashing overhead as a loud automated voice crackled through hidden speakers. Structural failure detected in northern containment sector. The entire tunnel trembled faintly beneath their feet. Dust drifted from the ceiling above. Victor turned sharply toward the deeper rail tunnel while several of his men exchanged nervous looks. Walter grabbed Ethan's sleeve urgently. The frozen lake, he whispered. If the northern sector collapses, it will seal the lower exits forever. Then somewhere deep within the mountain, a thunderous cracking sound echoed upward through the underground facility like ice splitting apart beneath enormous pressure. Mountains remember every secret buried beneath them, but eventually even stone begins to break under the weight. The underground tunnel trembled again as emergency alarms echoed through Black Pine Ridge. Dust rained from cracked concrete overhead while red warning lights flashed across the walls in uneven bursts. Ethan grabbed Walter's arm to keep the older man steady as another deep cracking sound rolled somewhere through the northern sections of the facility. Victor Lang remained calm despite the growing instability around them, but several men behind him exchanged uneasy glances toward the ceiling. Rex barked sharply toward the rail tunnel ahead, then immediately turned and sprinted deeper into the darkness. Rex, Ethan shouted. The German shepherd paused only long enough to make sure Ethan followed before disappearing around a bend farther down the tracks. Walter pointed urgently. He knows the way to the lake. Ethan hesitated only a second before helping Walter forward. Behind them, Victor stepped aside rather than blocking their path. You will not survive outside without the archive, he called after Ethan. Your father understood that before the end. Ethan ignored him and continued down the tunnel beside Walter while alarms continued repeating overhead. The deeper they moved into the northern section, the colder the air became. Frost covered entire sections of the walls now, and thin sheets of ice spread across the rails beneath their boots. Rex waited farther ahead, near a heavy security door hanging partially open. Beyond it, pale blue light reflected through the darkness. Ethan pushed the frozen door wider and stopped instantly. An enormous underground cavern stretched before them beneath the mountain itself. At the center lay a massive frozen lake glowing faintly beneath industrial floodlights still operating on emergency backup power. Thick support pillars rose from the ice into darkness overhead, while old catwalks crossed portions of the cavern walls. Ethan stared in disbelief. This place is enormous. Walter nodded weakly. The containment sector was built beneath a natural glacier reservoir. Rex moved carefully onto the ice, without hesitation. Ethan followed slower, helping Walter step across the frozen surface while cracks echoed faintly somewhere beneath them. The lake stretched nearly 300 yards toward the opposite side of the cavern, where an old freight elevator platform stood against the far wall. Above it, faded painted letters read North Access Lift. "That is our exit," Walter said breathlessly. Halfway across the lake, Ethan noticed strange shapes trapped beneath the ice. Old crates, broken equipment, even vehicles partially frozen under layers of clear blue ice. Then his flashlight passed over something that made him stop completely. Beneath the frozen surface rested another kennel enclosure almost identical to the ones upstairs. Frost coated the metal bars while faded black lettering remained barely visible. Subject, transfer unit. Ethan felt cold spread through him again. "They moved the dogs through here," he whispered. Walter looked away silently. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound split across the lake beneath their feet. Thin fractures spread through the ice several yards away. Rex barked immediately and moved faster toward the elevator platform. Ethan tightened his grip on Walter and continued carefully, every step now echoing across the frozen cavern. Behind them, flashlight beams suddenly appeared at the tunnel entrance. Victor and his men had entered the chamber. "Ethan," Victor called calmly across the ice. "If you leave with the map, you will never stop running." Ethan kept moving. Another section of ice cracked loudly behind them. Victor's expression finally hardened. "Your father hid the archive because he knew what was coming," he shouted. "The program was never about the dogs." Ethan stopped for one brief second and turned back. "Then what was it about?" Victor looked directly at Rex, standing near the elevator platform. "It was about memory." Then somewhere deep beneath the frozen lake, something massive shifted under the ice. Some memories are so dangerous that entire governments will bury them beneath mountains and ice just to keep them hidden. Ethan stood frozen on the cracking lake while Victor Lang's final words echoed through the cavern. It was about memory. The phrase settled heavily in Ethan's mind as another deep tremor rolled beneath the ice. Rex barked sharply near the freight elevator platform, pacing anxiously while Walter struggled to stay upright beside Ethan. The fractures spreading across the frozen lake widened slowly with loud groaning sounds that echoed throughout the chamber. Victor and his men remained near the tunnel entrance, careful not to advance too quickly onto the unstable ice. "You deserve the truth, Ethan," Victor called across the cavern. "Your father knew the project could change intelligence operations forever." Ethan stared back at him. "You train dogs to remember locations." Victor shook his head slightly. "Not locations. People." Silence followed except for the cracking ice beneath their feet. Victor continued walking slowly onto the lake, speaking calmly despite the instability around him. Black Pine Ridge discovered that emotional memory could survive separation far longer than expected. Certain subjects retained recognition patterns for years. Ethan glanced at Rex again. The German shepherd remained focused entirely on Ethan, ignoring everyone else in the cavern. Victor noticed. "That dog found you because he was conditioned never to forget you." Ethan frowned in confusion. "I did not even meet Rex until I was 16. Walter suddenly spoke beside him, voice filled with regret. "That is what they told you." Ethan turned sharply toward the old man. Walter lowered his eyes. "Your father removed Rex from the program when you were a child. After your mother died, Daniel feared the facility would use you both as leverage." Ethan felt the world shift beneath him harder than the trembling ice ever could. "What are you talking about?" Walter swallowed painfully before answering. "Rex was around you years before you remember him. Your father believed emotional imprinting became stronger through early exposure." Ethan stared at the dog in disbelief. Fragments of distant childhood memories suddenly surfaced. A large shepherd running through snow. Warm fur beside a hospital bed. A bark echoing somewhere from long ago. Memories he always assumed belonged to different dogs over different years. Rex slowly walked back toward Ethan and rested his head gently against his hand. The familiarity in that moment felt ancient. Real. Victor stopped several yards away now, careful on the unstable ice. Daniel stole the archive because he discovered the research could eventually influence human memory retention as well, he said quietly. Governments would have weaponized it within years. Ethan looked at the folded map still inside his jacket. So the archive proves all of this. Victor nodded. Every recording, every experiment, every name involved. Walter grabbed Ethan's sleeve urgently. If that archive reaches the outside world, they will hunt him forever. Victor answered before Ethan could speak. If the archive disappears, Everything Daniel sacrificed dies with this mountain. Another violent crack thundered beneath the ice. Sections near the tunnel entrance suddenly collapsed inward, sending freezing water surging upward between widening fractures. Victor stepped backward immediately, while several of his men retreated towards solid ground. Red emergency lights flickered wildly across the cavern as alarms screamed louder overhead. Rex barked sharply toward the elevator platform again. Walter pointed weakly through the chaos. The lift still works on emergency power. Ethan looked between Walter, Victor, and Rex while the frozen lake continued breaking apart beneath them. Then Victor spoke one final sentence that stopped Ethan cold. "Your father never escaped Black Pine Ridge, Ethan," he said quietly. "He stayed behind to protect you. In the end, the truth was never hidden inside the mountain. It was carried out by the only creature that refused to forget." The frozen lake continued breaking apart beneath Black Pine Ridge while alarms screamed through the collapsing facility. Ethan stood motionless for one final second, staring at Victor laying across the widening fractures in the ice. "Your father stayed behind to protect you." The words echoed louder in Ethan's mind than the cracking glacier beneath his feet. Rex barked sharply beside the freight elevator platform, snapping Ethan back to reality. Walter nearly collapsed as another violent tremor shook the cavern. "Go," Walter whispered urgently. "The lift will not hold much longer." Ethan grabbed Walter's arm and helped him across the final stretch of unstable ice, while freezing water surged upward through spreading cracks behind them. Victor remained farther back near the tunnel entrance, watching silently as sections of the cavern's ceiling began shedding snow and debris onto the lake below. For the first time since Ethan met him, Victor no longer looked confident. He looked tired, like a man who had spent too many years protecting something that should have been buried long ago. Rex reached the elevator controls first and barked again. Ethan pulled the heavy emergency lever beside the platform while red warning lights flashed overhead. Somewhere deep inside the mountain, old machinery groaned painfully before the freight elevator finally began lowering toward the cavern floor. Walter leaned heavily against the railing, struggling to breathe. Ethan removed the folded map from his jacket and stared at it one last time. The archive. Every secret connected to Black Pine Ridge. Every hidden name. Every experiment. Victor noticed the hesitation immediately from across the ice. "If that archive survives," he called out over the alarms, "they will hunt you for the rest of your life." Ethan looked down at Rex standing beside him. The German shepherd remained calm despite the chaos around them, eyes fixed entirely on Ethan with unwavering trust. Not conditioning. Not programming. Trust. Ethan finally understood what his father protected all those years ago. Not the research. Not the facility. The bond itself. A connection nobody inside Black Pine Ridge ever truly understood. Another section of the cavern's ceiling cracked loudly overhead. Victor stepped backward as ice collapsed between them. Ethan made his decision. He pulled the old photograph of his father from his jacket beside the map, looked at both one final time, then placed them carefully inside the freight elevator control box beneath the emergency transmitter panel. Walter stared at him in confusion. Ethan activated the transmitter switch. Weak static crackled through the system before a blinking green signal light appeared across the panel. The archive was broadcasting automatically now through every surviving emergency frequency connected to the mountain. Victor's expression changed instantly. "What did you do?" Ethan looked across the collapsing lake calmly. "My father already made his choice." Sirens intensified throughout the facility as structural failure warnings echoed from hidden speakers. The freight elevator finally locked into place beside them. Ethan helped Walter inside, while Rex jumped aboard immediately. Before the doors fully closed, Ethan looked back one last time toward the frozen cavern collapsing beneath the mountain. Victor still stood alone across the shattered ice, illuminated by flashing red lights and falling snow drifting through cracks in the ceiling above. Then the elevator door sealed shut. The platform began rising slowly through the emergency shaft toward the surface, while the mountain groaned beneath them like something ancient finally breaking apart. Nearly 20 minutes later, the elevator emerged into the freezing night high above Black Pine Ridge. Snowstorms covered the mountains in endless white beneath the dark Montana sky. Ethan stepped out beside Rex, while Walter leaned weakly against the railings near the exit platform. Far below them, deep within the mountain, distant rumblings slowly faded into silence. Black Pine Ridge was finally gone. Rex moved beside Ethan and pressed against his leg while snow drifted softly around them in the freezing wind. Ethan looked down at the German shepherd and rested his hand gently against the dog's neck. Somewhere far behind them, hidden beneath ice, stone, and silence, the past disappeared forever. But Rex still remembered.